RioCan and SmartCentres and RioCan. Normally I'd do this video like a debate. It's like a classic Apple versus Mac or Apple versus Android. Well, these two Canadian REITs have been exhibiting some interesting behavior since their drop in March 2020. So I'm going to go through the ratios again, just like I did last year, and see what might be the reason behind that. There's actually some interesting stuff, so let's get into it. Okay, so let's just understand where we're at right now. So in this table, I've got the numbers for RioCan and SmartCentres. The two columns on the left are from last year, Q2 2020, and the two columns on the right are the same quarter, but from this year. So you can see that market cap of RioCan is still a little bit higher than SmartCentres, and the drop from last year's peak. You can see the peaks here of where they reached, where their current prices are, and the percent drop. You can see that both of them have recovered, but SmartCentres is only 6% below its 2020 peak. It's recovered a lot more than RioCan. Now, the really interesting part about this is you'll notice that the dividend from RioCan from last year was $1.44. That's an annualized dividend versus 96 cents. So they've actually reduced their dividend by a third, and this happened at the end of 2020. Now we'll get into that a little bit later, but there was a big change at RioCan at the end of last year. Ed Sonshine, the former founder and CEO of this REIT, actually stepped down and is now serving as a chair member. There is a new sheriff in town, a new CEO. His name is Jonathan Gitlin. He's been with the company for about 15 years, so he's well versed in what RioCan does, and he helped build that strategy that RioCan had of concentrating on urban centers only. He's been pretty involved with growing this company, and I wouldn't expect any major changes with him, other than maybe concentration a little bit on the ESG side of the company. I'm not too concerned with the leadership change here, just a little skeptical whether the timing was because of, where things were at with this REIT at the time. Now, we may as well talk a little bit about the management and CEO of SmartCentres. So some unfortunate news there was actually in June. Peter Ford, the CEO, went on leave to take care of some medical issues. Unfortunately, his medical condition got the better of him, and earlier this week, SmartCentres announced that Peter had actually passed away, and so the acting manager, Mitchell Goldar, is now taking over for him. He has also been with the company for 30 years. He has been part of the strategy of intensification, which is like building out their current properties with multi-use types of facilities. So again, a long-time SmartCentres guy. I wouldn't expect a huge change in direction for the company out of him. I think he's well versed with the company. No concerns there. So jumping down to that last line with the yield there, that is the reason why RioCan is at 4.3% and SmartCentres is at 6.1%. But stay tuned, because in a couple sections I'm going to talk about whether this is sustainable or not. Now let's jump down to the revenue section. So I've got the Q2 revenue numbers there. You can see from the first line, not a ton of improvement from last year, but the growth year over year is at least in the positives this quarter versus last year, which was in the negatives. The net operating income, you guys know this is a big deal for REITs now. Pretty healthy and has gone up for both of these REITs, but it's important to know that for SmartCentres, the number that they have here includes a sale of a condo building. Now, if I take that out and I put in the number without the sale, you can see that 25% goes down to about 12.9%. I mean, still good, but there, just so you know, there's a little bit of a caveat there with the way that they've put the NOI together. Now, if you go to the same property NOI, now these are properties that are owned both last year and this year, you can see that these have gone up as well. But one thing that you guys need to know about this is that both of these REITs have been allowing for what are called provisions during COVID to some of their tenants. And what these provisions are could be putting in some of their own money to make up gaps in rent or deferring rents for certain tenants. And what they're trying to do is keep those tenants signed up and not let them default, so that when things come back, they've got a store to open in their properties. Now, both these companies, you can see from the numbers in the financial statement, are actually not having to provide as much provisions to their tenants as they were in the last few quarters. They're slowly rolling that up. So that's good that it's moving in the right direction, but do note that, some of this money is coming out of RioCan and SmartCentres pockets. So the reason that these percentages are up is because they're actually having to basically donate less money to their tenants. Now, they are confident that any rent deferrals will be paid back once things get back to normal, but just something to keep an eye on when you're reading these statements. Finally, the total net income is good because for the same reason, it's gone into positive numbers rather than fully negative like they were last year. Again, just because fewer provisions have been provided at this point. Now, in this next table, I'm going to talk a little bit about the stats regarding the tenants. Now, it's worth noting the last column for SmartCentres, I pulled most of these numbers, the 94, the 60 to 70%. These are from the Q1 presentation because they don't have these numbers in the financial statement. But occupancy, pretty steady across the board for both these REITs, and that's because they were doing all these special things for their tenants to keep them as customers and not let them default out of their leases. The percent of rent collected, however, a lot higher than it was in Q2 last year, so that is great news. Now you can see from this slide from the Q1 presentation of SmartCentres that there was assistance being provided in the second quarter of last year in the form of the CECRA. So while that did help fill the gap last time, this assistance has run out and really doesn't seem to be required as the REITs have recovered well. Now, looking at the stats for the essential tenants, you'll note that RIO is higher in the strong and stable type of tenant they have. So these are guys that we'll say are essential services like grocery stores, doctor's offices, but also the stable tenants would be something like a dentist's office where they are usually going to be kept open or they're not too concerned about their ability to pay rent even if they are closed. You can see SmartCentres, the same thing, has had an increase in these types of essential tenants, but keep in mind that it could be because some of the non-essentials have closed for now, but they're providing this stat to give you some confidence that they will be able to continue to collect rent like this. So if their rent collection has gone up and now they have a higher percentage of essential tenants, then that gives you some confidence that the rent will still be able to be collected. The other thing too is they've probably got a better understanding of what an essential or stable service is now that COVID has gone through ups and downs for 18 months. So that probably factors into this number a little bit as well. Okay, now let's finally get into the ratios, and here's where it gets interesting. You gotta pay close attention. So I've included the current and total ratio. Those are nice to know, but not the whole story for REITs because of how their main assets depreciate and disappear off the balance sheet over time. Okay, so let's look at the funds from operations. First glance, have increased from last quarter to this quarter. The FFO per unit for both of them has gone up, which is great, and the distribution per unit, here is where there's a change for RioCan, and that RioCan has gone from 36 to 24 cents per unit. Okay, the payout ratio then, as you can see, last quarter was crazy high, and definitely over 100% is not going to be sustainable. So that is why RioCan went and corrected their dividends. It's a way to get their payout ratio down to a nice healthy 60%. That's kind of where you want to see it. Meanwhile, SmartCentres is still a little bit high. Now, if the rest of the financials looked okay, you'd maybe just keep an eye on this to see if they could, bring the average down over the year. There's actually a big difference here because SmartCentres, again, included those condo sales as part of their funds from operations. And maybe normally you would say that's like okay if you saw SmartCentres selling condos every quarter. But when you look at the financial statement, we know for a fact last Q2, they weren't selling any condos. So now what happens if you take away the condo sales? Well, that 100K will go down to $87,500. And if you plug that into the FFO per unit, that actually brings it down from 0.58 to 0.505. Now that brings your payout ratio to 91.1%, which is actually higher than the year to date. Initially, when I looked at their performance since the drop in March 2020, I thought SmartCentres was recovering faster for a couple different reasons. First off, they're more geographically diverse. They have properties in multiple provinces, and as we have seen during this illness, that provinces have waves at slightly different times, but at most given times, you'd have a shopping center open in most of the provinces. In a sense, that diversification, I thought, would help SmartCentres. The other reason I thought was because, they didn't cut their dividend. But when I look at these numbers and these specific ratios, I'm really questioning whether SmartCentres is going to be able to keep their dividend this high. They can't be selling condo buildings and condos every quarter because they simply can't build them as fast as they want to sell them. So because of that, I think that they might actually trim their dividend. Now, they may get away with it. They may find a way to fund their dividends, maybe by, borrowing money, but that's not what you want to see in a REIT. I'm actually leaning more towards RioCan for the fact that they've already gone through, they bit the bullet in December, they brought their dividend down, they're in a good spot with their payout ratio. Whereas I think SmartCentres is a little bit unknown for me, and the fact that it's got a higher stock price makes me feel that I'm not really too sure what will happen if the dividend cut comes along. So I'm actually leaning a little bit more towards RioCan on this one, but what do you guys think? Which one of these do you hold? Do you think SmartCentres is going to be able to make it out of this without having to cut a dividend, maybe just keep it the same for a while? Let me know what you think in the comments below. So if this video has helped you, remember to hit that like button to get the video out to more people. I hope you guys have found it valuable. It's helped you in your research. But until next time, have a great week, everyone. Spread the wealth. We'll see you in the next one. Bye. There was also a lot of assistance from the government in the form of the CRs. But there's a big but here, and that there's a big but here. There's a big difference here because there's a big but.